Perhaps you, as a program maker, perhaps you could explain the process of you, where it starts for you, sort of in terms of the receiving the script or discussing the ideas in the script and bringing the concept alive in the beautiful way in which you did that. And I thought, as we were talking earlier on, for me, one of the great joys of the Crown, and that was a great example of it, is whilst we're familiar with the general story of the Queen's life, but to pick up on important things that happened to her, which may have been slightly forgotten about, and use that as a way of telling the story of the journey of the monarchy during her reign.
Yes, here they are.
Oh.
So we can get them to come out.
Hello.
Tags off.
Have you been chatting for some time?
No, we take our dog tags.
We have.
Okay.
Damien was just asking a question, but I just want to say that I was fortunate enough to have known John Grigg, as I knew, incredibly well, because he was a very, very close friend of my father's. And to see, I didn't know that story actually, but he was so unlike the attack dog of, you know, the modern journalist, and it's very interesting to see the effect of a an honourable journalist in a way. He was so self-effacing and so would have believed in everything, and I thought you betrayed him wonderfully. And Patsy, of course, his wife,
Yes,
who
absolutely.
made him go to that meeting. That is so her. Which turned out to be with the Queen, not with
Not with Charteris.
not with Charteris, exactly.
Yes,
So,
yes.
sorry, that's just a little personal anecdote I wanted to contribute.
Oh, how lovely. Do you want to introduce? This is Peter Morgan, everybody.
Hello.
And
Hello.
this is Suzanne Mackie, who is our wonderful executive producer, and Peter, the fantastic writer of The Crown. You were just asking how I got involved, weren't you?
Yes. Well, I was actually, as you're here as well, I was asking Philippa maybe she could sort of lift the curtain a little bit on the Crown for us and explain the start of the process of taking the episode that we've watched. Where you start is Philippa given a script and said, right, go and make that, or is there a discussion about the script as it comes together and the ideas that sort of form the episode? We were saying as you came in, and Philippa and I talked about this before the screening. One of the things that I, as a sort of viewer, find most enjoyable about The Crown is that the general story of the Queen's reign is familiar to us, but there are lots of important aspects of it, stories that may have been forgotten about or their significance not been looked at, and The Crown does that, and in a way where each film is a sort of standalone story as well, could actually be viewed, it's part of a series, but could be viewed by itself as well as a complete story. So Philippa, perhaps you could...
Well, for me, that was the lovely thing about this episode, that Peter had taken this microcosmic story and grown this beautiful script from it. And it was an absolute pleasure and joy to make it, because it is a tiny little corner of history, but it says so much, doesn't it? And that I really loved. And also I loved meeting the real Patricia, and who gave us lots of lovely hints about how to dramatise Lord Altrincham, his character and his nature. So that was really helpful. But it all starts with the script, really. That's the beginning of these journeys. And with Peter's work, it's always incredibly exciting and wonderful to see what he's coming up with.
Well, I probably spend the most time not writing the episodes, but sort of, like one of those baths in an old country house where you turn the taps on and filth comes out, and you need to run it for a long time. And I feel I have to do that to get the bad ideas out. And when you approach a decade, you're so brainwashed, or you've become so conditioned to think in terms of the greatest hits of that particular decade. And so then you've got to think, well, which part of those greatest hits would it be irresponsible to not include? Profumo, the Kennedys, or yes? And which part would it be surprising to include? And I do sort of take by now as the barometer of whether people will know a story or not, like Altrincham, whether I've heard of it or not. You know, I sort of think I've crawled across this stuff long enough now to, you know, to probably be something of a specialist. And if I'm going, ooh, I had no idea. If it's making me go, ooh, and Altrincham very much did. And I remember being really excited about writing the episode because I felt that he clearly wasn't going to be a character that would run throughout the season. So yeah, and I remember we had all these meetings about it has to be a star, and when Philippa found, I think he's just a fantastic actor, John Heffernan, and I wasn't aware of him before, and of course he's, you know, everybody that does know, you know, knew all about him, and so, you know, I'm currently, my head is immersed in the third and the fourth seasons of this show because I'm planning and plotting, and so I'm going through exactly the process that you were asking about there, which is to sort of go how, and then you have to factor into that the way in which people are watching television now. You know, they're not watching one episode at a time once a week. I'm sorry. I'm not apologising to a microphone. You know, they're watching sometimes in groups of 2 or 3, and you know, this binge watching phenomenon. You know, as a dramatist, you sort of have to start thinking, how do you write and structure episodes and the flow of a whole season differently in the way to take into consideration the way that people are watching television now.
I mean, interestingly, casting our mind back, 3 years, when you were plotting out season 1, you had also plotted out season 2. The architecture of those 2 seasons had been plotted out, and this episode, Altrincham, was always going to be part of season 2. And I think that clearly that story had captured your imagination, and we knew that somehow it represented a shift in the attitudes towards the prevailing attitudes towards the Queen and the monarchy at that time. It was a great encapsulation of a shift in time, potentially the age of deference changing, and again, I came at this story completely anew, and it was a delightful surprise. But it was a brilliant way in which to say the times are a-changing. So right from the very beginning of this whole venture, some 3 years ago, possibly even more, that as the architecture over 2 seasons, this one was always going to be part of it. And I think that's very exciting as well, because you know then you've got this big overarching sort of journey that you're embarking on, and you know which points and which moments you're going to hit and which actually you might not. And I think that's very exciting, bold, but always to be refreshed and spontaneity being part of it. But it's great to know you've got your building blocks in place, I think.
John Grigg, the killer of debutantes' balls.
But did he do it?
A black day. What?
Can I just ask one more question, and then I think we'll obviously go to the audience. I mean, you said a moment ago, Peter, that you didn't get. I'm not trying to insult the actor, but a star to play John Grigg, and I think that was actually really a really good thing, because
Philippa wouldn't let us try.
No, because
Philippa had much better taste than me, and she was she knew, yeah.
But absolutely right, because of the nature of the man. I'm going to ask a slightly bigger question, because I noticed so many people on the screen there who are our talent, but you're doing this for Netflix. Are you concerned about the potential detriment to our public service broadcasting here if talent like all of you are, and I could see the money there because I used to make television, are doing things for Netflix and not for ITV or BBC?
No. I mean, everybody involved in that. I mean, that's like asking the question. Bond. The money for Bond comes from somewhere else, and we think of that as being very English. And in the end, we went to the BBC, we went to ITV. We desperately tried to create a partnership between BBC and Netflix, You know, we felt very nervous about telling the story without somehow the sort of, you know, without the stamp of the Ministry of TV being all over it, you know, auntie. It just didn't work out. Netflix and BBC just weren't ready to partner. They are now. They're partnering a lot now. But you know, this was at the end of 2013, at the beginning of 2014 that we did this, and Netflix were really keen to have this show. It turned out all to themselves as part of their international push, and as such, it's a real piece of, you know, it's almost more almost more English in that it's a piece of Britain being taken out, you know, into the world, and it's in that sense it's a big export. I have no problem. My conscience is completely clear.
But also it doesn't preclude us. I mean, Philip has just made one of the best dramas I've seen in years, or three. I'm not just saying that because you're sitting there. Three girls. I mean, you know, one doesn't preclude the other.
No, I think they complement each other, and I think it's the level of creativity in shows like The Crown can only add to the general level of wonderful creativity in this country. People come to this country to make imaginative, amazing drama. Loads of American shows come here, and it's very exciting for us all. It's an amazingly exciting time in our industry, actually. Yeah.
Can I just ask one very quick supplementary just on that? Is in this season in particular, you've sought to deal with, you know, to look into the marriage of Philip and Elizabeth, and obviously the pre-briefing for the second season was looking at allegations around Philip's alleged infidelity. Do you think you could have made this season in the way you've made it if it was being broadcast by the BBC?
I don't know. I really don't know. I would have written it like this, and because I would hope they wouldn't want to censor me. I mean, I don't think anything we're saying is controversial. I really don't. I think that the marriage is clearly a triumph. Yeah, they've been married for 70 years. I don't want to give the ending away or anything. You know, and if there were complexities on the way, that makes them just about like any other marriage that's lasted 70 years. And
they're laughing together still.
Right? I mean, it's very hard to get upset on their behalf. They seem to have done rather well.
Yeah, I suppose what I was hitting at, because people have put this to me as chair of the select committees, will privately say, well, you know, would there be issue? Would the palace be on the phone to the BBC saying, well, you know, we're not really sure about what you're doing here? And
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay. Good.
Not in my experience of making really, really difficult, hard-hitting stuff for the BBC, which is very different from The Crown. No.
Yeah.
I really don't think they would.
Good. Well, let's put that to bed. Any questions? Yes, here.
So you're talking about how at the moment you're planning series 3 and 4, and presumably with a view to the full picture. And I suppose one of the things that's most impressive about the series is how you managed to steer away from being sensational while still being dramatic. And there's a feeling of truth to it, even when it's, I assume, complete fabrication. With the sort of greater arc of the series, how much is it predestined versus will be affected by, say, were Philip to die and allegations come out, that kind of thing? How much of it is set, the narrative now in your head, how it will continue versus what will be affected by current events?
I mean, there are about 46 questions wrapped up in that. I certainly wouldn't. There's nothing that could happen that would make me want to change the story that we're telling. And it's back to that bathtub, and you know, one's first instincts, you know, particularly as you enter a period of time where Diana, you know, one always takes quite a sigh, where Diana enters the story, because, you know, because of expectations and because it being, I think of it as a sort of almost narratively and dramatically, it's almost haemophilia. If you just touch it, it bruises. And you have to be really, really careful how you handle it. And many, I have to spend. It's the process that we went that I was describing earlier. I spend a long time trying to get the bad ideas out, and trying to step away from something being too hot. At the same time, you cannot deny, you know, some of these things are inflamed, you know, and they are sensitive, and not to tackle them head on would be irresponsible. And so I'm wrestling with this the whole time. It's really a matter of conscience, which also comes to truth and accuracy, which is another thing you alluded to. And again, you have your conscience as a dramatist and your sense of responsibility. Happily, these people that we're writing about and dramatising and making these programs about, you know, they're well I mean, where they go and what they do is a matter of public record. So we sort of know where they are at a given time and what they're doing at a given time. And I've got this big bunch of researchers who are all fabulous, and I'm trying to get the dots to be closer so that me joining the dots becomes less an act of fantasy and more an act just of the imagination. And I completely accept, and this goes to certain historians who are like, but what the Crown got wrong. Of course I get it wrong, but my view is an audience will either reject, an audience is so sensitive and has such fine instincts. If an audience rejects it, then it was probably wrong. Even if you don't know the facts, you can smell when something is bogus and irresponsible. And we do our very, very best to get it right. And sometimes I have to conflate. I have to say, we call it in our research, I put it to the jury. I say, and we call it timey-wimey. So if something happened in 47 and we want to put it in an episode that takes place in 49, I put it to the jury. I say, is it too timey-wimey? And people go, well, I think you can fudge it because there was another incident that wasn't quite as juicy, but which pertained to the same underlying truth. And you sometimes have to forsake accuracy, but you must never forsake truth. You know.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question about? I can see on the titles inspired by the audience. So did you start with?
I've never sat through that. It really. I didn't know it said that.
Did you start with writing the audience, and at which point did you think you could tell the story really from beginning to end in this form?
Well, briefly, I wrote the audience, and then it was, you know, because it leapt around in time in the way that it did. I don't know if you saw it, but it was sort of quite cubist. It went back and forth and in and out, and it felt to me completely unadaptable. I had written Frost Nixon before, and that went straight from the stage to the screen. I didn't want that. I wanted this to be a purely theatrical experience. But then when I was writing the scene between her and Churchill, I sort of fell in love with that. I fell in love with her in her early to mid-20s, and Churchill in his early to mid-70s. And just a young woman starting out and an old man fading out. And it turned out that the relationship between them, like an educating reader, was more complex, that each was using the other in quite an interesting way. And I started thinking of that as a film. And then I kept thinking, well, where does the story start? Well, it should start, I suppose, when she becomes queen. And then it was like, well, hang on a minute, she becomes queen because of the unexpected death of her father. So let's just start with the father's illness. And it just kept, I kept thinking, well, there's more. And that's all that happened. There was a constant, never-ending process of me going, oh, but there's more, you know. And it kept expanding. And the truth is, I could slow the journey through time down, and we could have done at least twice as many episodes covering the period of time. It's so endlessly riveting. And the family is so endlessly complex, and the situation is so... And I, you know, because having written the film and the play, you really think I'd had enough by now. You know, and it just gets more interesting. The more you drill down, the more interesting it gets, you know, I think.
Does it worry you that about yourself?
Slightly. I mean, it's not particularly dignified, is it? I mean, to be writing about these people.
I assume it's not what you thought it was going to be. No,
I want to write something with guns and bank robbery.
Like that.
I want to write Heat or Sopranos.
Yeah.
not these people.
You seem to. My impression of the episodes I've watched so far is the sort of, if you like, the anti-hero characters are rather glorious. The sort of people who are the inside the tent challengers of the monarchy. I mean, the Duke of Windsor, I think, is beautifully, brilliantly, wickedly portrayed. Princess Margaret, the Duke of Edinburgh. It already tantalises us for thinking of how Diana will be introduced later on as well. I mean, do you think, for you, are these sort of forces sort of pressing against the monarchy an important part of the story?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I also loved writing Lascelles. You know, the monster within, and he came to me purely through the talents of that. I had written him in quite just a sort of formulaic way, I guess. And then the actor was so gifted. As soon as I heard him speak, I just fell madly in love. It was a subject of some. I mean, everyone slightly teased me. I was just so in love with him. I just would ask him to say anything and do anything, and I would just keep writing more and more and more for him because, you know. But I think that's what happens. I think as a writer, you gravitate towards certain people, and then you start constructing narratives around that person a little bit.
Any other questions? Yes.
How many different directors are there, and how much say does the director have, and how much the producer and the writer? So you mentioned the casting of altering it. You must have these discussions quite a lot.
Yeah, so I'm the only woman director, I have to say, for any budding women directors in the room. There is the fabulous Stephen Daldry, Philip Martin and Ben Karen, all fabulous actually. And they did the first series, and I was very lucky to come and do the second series with them. And it's a real collaboration, really, isn't it? We go and sit with, one of my delights is to work with fantastic writers like Peter. I find it really exciting. So I loved going and sitting with Peter in his house and the Brains Trust, as he calls them, all the researchers and the script editors, and working through the script. And then casting, we talk about it, everything, don't we, really? And then going away and finding all the locations, casting it, imagining new scenes and saying to Peter, would you mind putting that deer hunting scene in?
Oh, yeah.
Things like that.
You love a deer.
No, that was.
I wanted that.
That was not my fault.
No, that was not Peter's fault.
And the other thing to say is that Peter, I mean, what's brilliant, what's been brilliant right from the very beginning of all this is that the scripts, Peter tends to deliver the scripts, 10 episodes, before we've even, almost as we're going into pre-production, which is unheard of. So you've got 10 scripts, you've got usually five directors, although we had 4 last season, and a crew that's come back. So we have the same crew, really great DPs and designers, and everyone's sort of like top of their game and fantastic. And almost without exception, every single one of those people have come back for the second season and are coming back for the third season, which is a really, I think, an incredibly rewarding outcome. But these 10 scripts are then with us right from the beginning, and we can start building on them. The directors can start working with Peter, we can start talking as a team. There's nothing abstract, there's no sort of like, look, we think this is coming down the line, but let me talk to Peter. It's there, we have it. And then everything from that gets better and better and better. And that, to have that foundation right at the beginning is, from a producer point of view, I cannot tell you how, A, impressive it is, and B, just it makes life so much easier. And yeah.
The directing, the process with the directors it differs, you know, every job you go to, but also culturally. You know, in the UK, we are quite different in the way that we do the writing and we do the directing. You know, it's quite, I mean, it's not just uncommon, it's unheard of, pretty much, that in America one writer, you know, goes through it all. And in America also, the way in which they use television directors, just the expectations and the traditions are different. There, a director will not be anywhere near as involved authorially as they are on this show, and you know, it's quite common for an American television director to have to hand, you know, they get a couple of days in the cutting room and maximum a week, and then they have to step aside for the showrunner or the producers to come in and finish the edit. Often there's a good reason for that, which is that if you have too many individual directors, you end up with quite a schizophrenic or indeed a multi-personality disorder television series, and actually it sometimes needs the controlling producers to come in and homogenize or take out the differences. Some directors are naturally comedic, some are naturally bleak, or and in this, I like to think that every single episode, and it's been the case so far, you reach final cut, which is which is the real money end of things. Final cut is where it's really ultimately what it all boils down to. And in this, I've reached final cut with each director on our own, no executives, we just do it on our own, and then they can like it or lump it.
I think we've got probably just time for one or two more questions before we end. So, Jack.
Firstly, Peter, you said you could easily get another 10 episodes into a series. So if you want to do a 20-episode series, please go ahead and do that.
That's very kind.
Secondly, obviously, key component of it is this level of on-screen talent you've got. How do you go about replacing Matt and Claire?
Well, the short answer to that is, there are two, A, that are irreplaceable, but B, we need to, because they can't possibly age, and to age them, would be ridiculous. They'd start looking silly, chalk in their hair and prosthetics. And so we're going to cast, and it so happens that Olivia Colman looks a little bit like Claire, but we would have been quite happy if we'd have found the right person who didn't particularly look like Claire. There will be times where the person that takes over from the previous person will not look like them, and that people might bump it a little bit. But I think our attitude is we're just going to cast the best people available, as if we were doing it from scratch, rather than thinking, we need someone to look like the previous incarnation. We're just going to recast and start all over again, and we're all terrified what that will be like. It'll feel like a whole different thing, but it's never been done before. So, they are sort of irreplaceable, and they've had 20 episodes to develop a fantastic chemistry together, on and off screen. But we're just going to have to start again.
It's quite exciting though to start again.
Are you recasting all the characters?
Yeah, every single one.
Yeah.
We even had a moment where we thought, well, hang on, if you're recasting, hypothetically, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's already in his 80s, are we really going to get someone in his 90s? That seems a bit weird. But actually, that's the right decision. You have to recast everyone. Otherwise, you're interacting.
No one's left
in
over.
season 3, the Duke of Windsor will die. That's it's no shock. He died in 1972. I think everyone knows. So then we thought, well, why not take Alex Jennings? Alex Jennings, it wouldn't take. He's so wonderful. Why would we cast someone else just for 5 episodes, only to have him croak? And but we're going to have to cast somebody completely different. And heartbreaking. There are so many people.
Yeah. But it's an all or nothing.
Yeah, as a casting concept.
It's taking Doctor Who to another level.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just abuse my chair's prerogative and ask a sort of final question before we finish? Just in terms of the pitch for the pitching process for The Crown, how much was written when you started talking to companies about buying it? Did you have, you said you had the story we've seen today about Lord Altrincham, you already had planned at the very start. But the process of pitching a massive series like this, how much was set before you started talking to companies about it?
I wrote the first 2 eps.
A sort of one, wasn't it?
Yeah, I wrote the first 2 episodes, and I hadn't really mapped it out. I sort of had a rough idea what we were going to do, but the first set of questions. I think I sold it. If I'm not no. By that point, I'd already realised that there is so much story that to do it in 3 seasons. The original idea was to do 1 season with her as a young woman, 1 as a middle-aged, and 1 as an older one. But it grew, and like I said, I would have loved to have carried on, stuck in that, in the 50s, just because it's such another land, But and it's horrifying to think that at the end of season 3 will be, Jim Callaghan, you know, it just feels like, whoop, how did that happen? It seems to have travelled suddenly, gone into warp speed. But, and it's such a shame, but, you know, but at the same time, it is hard work, and I'm quite looking forward to reaching the end.
I mean, one other thing to say is that I wasn't there, but Andy and Peter and Stephen Daldry sold it as a 20-hour commission to Netflix in the room. They sat there and then at the end of what was it, a week's pitching around town. They and as Peter said, we did imagine the BBC would form part of the dynamic. We didn't know how or what, but that we wanted. But Netflix sat there at the end of it. They looked at each other and said, "Yeah, we'll have that, please," and pretty much got the checkbook out. And that, for is that vote of confidence, that absolute sense of buying into something. There's no notes, there's no we'll come back to you. It's just absolute kind of conviction, and that gives you a lot of confidence to go forth.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. Their confidence. The two things that have really made writing it more exciting for me is their extraordinary confidence and trust. They really, really do not interfere whatsoever. I mean, at all. And they just went, we'll have that, and we'll go for it. We'll go for it completely. They went all chips on Red 16. And it was also it's a completely different medium, and that the fact that I felt that we were on the cutting edge of something, whilst at the same time writing about something that feels anything but cutting edge, was also helpful to make me feel less that I was, doing heritage telly. It felt more cutting edge, but because of who they were. So actually, I'm thrilled that it was Netflix.
That's interesting.
Thrilled because it galvanised me and energised me.
Going back to something I brought up earlier, does this mean you're going to have time to do other subjects? Because it would be sad if you got totally subsumed by the royal family.
I agree with you. I'm trying to tunnel out of the palace.
Good.
Is your vision that the story will run into its natural conclusion? Or do you think it needs to stop before it becomes too contemporary?
I don't know yet. I'm really completely...
The tunnelling is not going well, it sounds.
I can think no further than what I've committed to do.
Okay.
I can't, because when you get too close to present day, you run into that terrible problem of journalism. You do not want the drama to feel journalistic, and I've always felt that you need at least a decade, because without separation of time and without distance, there's no room for the metaphor.
Yeah.
It's just the reporting of something on one level, and history always, as soon as we write about Eden, for example, you see Iraq, or you see Brexit. And there's an episode in the second episode where women are being groped in a restaurant, and it had enormous resonance compared to where we are today. So you want there to feel like there's time for metaphor.
Well, I thought in Philippa's episode we watched the depiction of the Queen being at Balmoral, sort of remote from this breaking storm in London, was. I think I'm sure everyone could see the parallels there to issues that we address later in the series. Well, I think you'll agree that's been a treat both on screen and off, and we're extremely grateful for your time and being with us here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.